I spent 22 years building a career around one simple truth. Numbers never lie. People do. Companies do. Husbands and wives absolutely do. But the numbers, the transfers, the timestamps, the account balances quietly shifting at 2 a.m., those tell you exactly what happened and exactly who did it. I built my entire reputation as a forensic accountant on that principle, and for most of my adult life, I believed I was immune to the kind of deception I uncovered in other people's lives every single day. My wife proved me wrong on a Tuesday in March. I'd been working a federal case for 11 months, a securities fraud investigation involving a mid-sized investment firm called Callaway Capital out of Atlanta. My firm had been retained by the DOJ to trace roughly $40 million that had allegedly been moved through a series of shell companies to avoid capital gains reporting. It was meticulous, exhausting work, the kind of work that kept me at the office until 9 most nights and pulled me out of bed at 5 most mornings. My wife, Claire, had been patient about it. At least, that's what I told myself. She worked in private wealth management at a firm across town. We'd met 17 years ago at a compliance conference in Charlotte, back when she was a junior advisor and I was still building my reputation. She was sharp, funny, better with clients than anyone I'd ever seen. We married 2 years later, no kids, which we'd agreed on early, just the two of us, a house in Buckhead, and careers we both took seriously. I thought we were fine. I thought we were better than fine. The first number that didn't add up was a charge on our joint credit card, a restaurant I didn't recognize. Osteria Giotto, $68 on a Wednesday evening when I'd been in Washington for a deposition. I almost let it go. Claire ate out with clients all the time. It was a legitimate business expense. But the restaurant wasn't downtown near her office. It was in Decatur, 20 minutes from the house. And when I searched it, I saw it was a quiet Italian place with a reputation for dim lighting and private booths. I didn't say anything. I watched. Over the next 6 weeks, I applied the same methodology to my marriage that I applied to every financial investigation. I built a timeline. I tracked patterns. The Wednesday evenings when she came home late, slightly flushed, smelling faintly of a cologne that wasn't mine. The weekend conference she attended in Savannah that her firm's website showed no record of. The way her phone, which she'd always left charging on the kitchen counter, had migrated permanently to her nightstand, face down. I'm not a suspicious man by nature. I had to become one professionally, and once those instincts are trained into you, they don't turn off at the front door of your own house. I accessed our home's shared cloud backup. Nothing illegal. My name was on the account and found her location history had been selectively deleted. Not all of it, just certain days. The deletions themselves were a pattern. Every other Wednesday, occasional Saturdays. 3 times, a Friday that she told me she was working late. The name I found came from an unexpected direction. I was 3 weeks from wrapping the Callaway Capital case when I pulled a secondary ledger from a subsidiary account and found a series of transfers to a personal holding company called CG Ventures, LLC. I ran the registration, standard procedure, and the registered agent came back as one Graham Cole, managing director at Callaway Capital. Graham Cole. I didn't know that name. I ran it anyway because that's what I do. And then I ran it through every database I had access to. The LinkedIn profile showed him as 44 years old, unmarried, and a graduate of Emory University's business school. His photo showed a man who was broad-shouldered, tan in that deliberate way that comes from money and leisure, with the kind of easy smile that probably worked very well on clients, and, apparently, on other men's wives. I sat at my desk for a very long time after that. I pulled Claire's firm's client roster through a contact I had in the compliance department. Nothing her firm would have shared voluntarily, but not obtained illegally. Graham Cole had been a client of hers for 4 years. That was 3 years longer than Callaway Capital had been on the DOJ's radar, and 2 years before my firm had been brought into the investigation. I need you to understand what that meant. Not emotionally, I'll get to that, but professionally. My wife was in a personal relationship with the primary subject of a federal securities fraud case that I was working. If she knew anything about the case, if she had shared anything about the timeline or the scope of the investigation, the entire 11 months of work could be compromised. $40 million in fraudulent transfers, dozens of investor victims, a federal prosecution that had taken years to build. I didn't confront her. I called my supervisor at the DOJ instead. The meeting happened in a government building in downtown Atlanta, in a conference room with no windows. There were 3 people across the table from me. My DOJ contact, a woman named Sandra Marsh who I'd worked with twice before, an FBI financial crimes agent named Reeves, and a woman from the U.S. Attorney's Office, whose name I wrote down and immediately forgot because I was too focused on keeping my face neutral. I walked them through everything I had. The timeline, the location data, the client relationship, the holding company transfers. I kept my voice even. I used the same tone I used when presenting findings in court. Flat, factual, no editorializing. When I finished, Sandra looked at me for a long moment. "You understand what you're giving us," she said. It wasn't a question. "I understand what the evidence suggests," I said. "What you do with it is your department." Agent Reeves leaned forward. "Mr. Harmon, has your wife ever asked you directly about the Callaway investigation?" I thought about it carefully before I answered. "She asked once, about 8 months ago, how the case was going. I told her I couldn't discuss it. She didn't push." I paused. "She also knew, generally, that I was working something for the DOJ. She didn't know the target. Are you certain of that?" I wasn't. That was the honest answer, and I gave it to them. What I didn't tell them yet was what I'd found 2 nights before that meeting. I'd spent a Saturday afternoon while Claire was at her spin class going through the files on her work laptop, which she'd left open on the dining room table. I was looking for anything that connected her to Cole beyond a client relationship. What I found was worse than I expected and more complicated than I wanted. There were emails, 17 months of them, spanning from the beginning of their personal relationship through the previous week. Most of them were what you'd expect. The escalating intimacy of 2 people who had convinced themselves their choices were justified. The careful logistics of people who believed they were being discreet. But scattered through them were references I couldn't ignore. Cole mentioning that his attorneys were getting nervous about regulatory attention. Claire responding with details that were vague enough to have plausible deniability, but specific enough that someone who knew the investigation would recognize them immediately. Timelines. The involvement of outside forensic consultants. The fact that the DOJ was looking at subsidiary structures. She hadn't given him case files. She hadn't passed along documents, but she had told him enough that Cole had spent the past 8 months methodically restructuring his most exposed holdings, moving assets through new intermediaries, creating layers I had to spend weeks untangling. Work that should have been finished in the spring had stretched into winter because the target had been given just enough warning to keep shifting. My wife hadn't betrayed a federal investigation intentionally. I believe that. I believe she told a man she thought she was in love with just enough to feel close to him, not understanding what he was doing with the information. I believe she rationalized it the way people rationalize things they don't want to examine too closely. But belief doesn't change what happened, and it doesn't change what the law calls it. I gave Sandra Marsh everything 2 weeks before Thanksgiving. Every email, every piece of location data, a timeline of what Claire had shared and when, cross-referenced against Cole's subsequent asset movements. I built the case against my own wife the same way I would have built it against anyone else, methodically, completely, without gaps. Agent Reeves asked me once during our 3rd meeting whether I wanted to give my wife the opportunity to cooperate voluntarily before they moved forward. I thought about it longer than I should have. Here's what I kept coming back to. Claire had watched me work nights and weekends for 11 months on a case she knew was important to me. She had looked me in the face over dinners and weekend mornings and told me she was proud of the work I did. She had listened to me talk, in general terms, about the victims of financial fraud. The retirees who lost their savings, the pension funds, the ordinary investors who had trusted people like Cole with money they couldn't afford to lose. She had heard all of that, and then slept next to me and continued telling Cole what she knew. She hadn't asked me to stop working the case. She hadn't told me she had a conflict of interest. She had simply managed the problem silently, in the way that, I was beginning to understand, she managed most problems. No, I told Reeves. Let the process work the way it's supposed to. I moved into the guest room the night before Thanksgiving, telling Claire I'd been having trouble sleeping and didn't want to disturb her. She accepted this without question, which told me something about how present she'd been in our marriage for the past 1.5 years. I made Thanksgiving dinner for the 2 of us anyway. We ate at the dining room table and talked about her sister's new baby and whether we wanted to visit her parents for Christmas. Claire seemed lighter than she had in weeks. Cole had apparently told her that the regulatory pressure was easing. Whatever he'd done with the time she'd bought him, he believed it had worked. It hadn't. But she didn't know that yet. The arrest warrants were executed on a Monday morning in early December. I was in my office when it happened, exactly as I'd agreed with Sandra and Reeves. Cole was arrested at his office in Buckhead. Two of his senior partners were arrested simultaneously at their homes, and Claire was arrested in the parking garage of her firm at 8:45 in the morning. Before she reached the elevator, she called me from the federal detention facility at 2 in the afternoon. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to it twice. Her voice was controlled in the way that people who are very frightened sometimes become very controlled. She said she needed me to come. She said there had been a misunderstanding. She said she loved me. I called our attorney instead. Not her attorney. Mine. The federal charges against Claire included obstruction of justice and misprision of a felony, knowingly concealing information about ongoing criminal activity. Her attorney, a woman I'd never met who had been hired by Claire's firm, told the prosecutor that my wife had no knowledge of the criminal nature of Cole's conduct and had simply been involved in a personal relationship that she deeply regretted. The prosecutor presented the emails. Claire's attorney asked for a meeting. I attended with my own counsel. Claire sat across the conference table from me for the first time since her arrest, and she looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. Something past desperation, moving toward disbelief. She had understood, intellectually, that I had given information to the government. She had not yet fully processed what that meant. You knew, she said. Not an accusation. More like she was confirming something she was only now accepting. For about 3 months, I said, and you didn't tell me. No. She was quiet for a moment. How long did you know about Graham? Longer than that. The attorneys were watching us the way attorneys watch their clients when clients are about to say something inadvisable. Claire seemed to notice this and pulled herself back from whatever she'd been about to say next. I need you to tell them I didn't understand what I was doing, she said finally. Because I didn't, David. I swear to you I never thought. I know what you thought, I said. You thought you were protecting someone you cared about. You didn't think about the investors. You didn't think about the people whose retirement accounts Cole was using as a personal balance sheet. You didn't think about 11 months of work that nearly had to start over. I didn't know it was that serious. You knew it was a federal investigation. I kept my voice level. You knew I'd been working it for almost a year. You knew it involved financial crimes and that there were victims. You chose not to think too hard about the specifics. Her attorney touched her arm. Claire stopped talking. I thought about that moment for a long time afterward. There was a version of what happened next where I softened, where I told the prosecutor that my wife had been manipulated by a sophisticated fraudster, that she hadn't understood the gravity of what she was doing, that her cooperation going forward should earn her a reduced charge. I had that option. I could have exercised it. I want to be honest about the moment I decided not to. It wasn't anger exactly. It wasn't even about the affair, though I'd be lying if I said that had no weight. It was something quieter. It was sitting in that conference room looking at the woman I'd been married to for 15 years and realizing that she had made a calculation. She had weighed her interests against mine, against the interests of people she'd never met, against the integrity of work she knew mattered to me, and she had made a choice. Every time. For 17 months, she had looked at the scale and chosen herself. I had spent my entire career ensuring that the people who made that calculation faced the consequences of it. I didn't see a principled reason to make an exception. I filed for divorce the following week. My attorney handled the filing. The timing meant that our joint assets would not be subject to forfeiture in the federal case, since I had not been charged with any wrongdoing and the fraud proceeds had moved only through Cole's accounts. Claire's personal assets were a different matter. Her compensation from Callaway Capital clients, including Cole, was being reviewed for disgorgement. The civil suits were already forming. She called me 4 times from her attorney's office over the course of December. I returned 2 of the calls. Both conversations were short. She asked me to reconsider the divorce. I told her I hadn't made the decision out of anger, and that reconsideration wasn't the right word for what she was asking. She asked whether I still loved her. I told her that the love I had for the person I thought she wasn't transferable to the person she turned out to be. That was the last real conversation we had. Cole pleaded guilty in February to securities fraud, wire fraud, and obstruction. He received 11 years and was ordered to pay restitution of $43 million. The two partners received shorter sentences in exchange for cooperation. Claire's case moved more slowly. Her attorney negotiated aggressively in the U.S. Attorney's office was more interested in Cole than in her. In the end, she pleaded guilty to a single count of misprision, was sentenced to 18 months of supervised release, a $40,000 fine, and the permanent revocation of her financial licenses. Her career in wealth management was over. I heard about the sentencing from my attorney. I wasn't in the courtroom. I was in Phoenix that day, presenting findings in a different case, a municipal pension fund that had been systematically looted over 8 years by its own administrator. There were retirees in that courtroom who were going to get some of their money back because of the work I'd done. I thought about that while my attorney read the sentencing details over the phone. She asked if you were going to be there, my attorney said. Before the hearing. What did you tell her? That I didn't know. I looked out the window of the federal building at the desert sky. Is she all right? My attorney paused. She's standing. Her sister was with her. That was enough. I didn't need more than that. The divorce was finalized in April. The house sold in June. I moved into a smaller place in Virginia Highlands, closer to my office, with a kitchen I actually used and a guest room I left empty. My work didn't slow down. If anything, I took more cases than I had before, which my colleagues noticed and said nothing about, because they'd all read enough about what had happened to understand why. A journalist contacted me in the summer for a profile piece about the Callaway Capital case. She wanted to know how it felt to have uncovered what she called the personal dimension of the fraud. I thought about the question for long enough that she followed up with a gentler version of it. I built my career on the principle that the numbers tell you what actually happened, I said. That's still true. The numbers told me what was happening in my own marriage before I was willing to see it. I just had to decide whether to apply the same standards at home that I apply everywhere else. That sounds very difficult, she said. It was, I said. I won't pretend it wasn't, but the alternative was deciding that some people are above the standard, and once you start doing that, you've lost the thing that made the work mean anything in the first place. She asked me whether I had any regrets. I've thought about that question more honestly in private than I did in that interview. The honest answer is that I regret the 17 years I apparently spent not knowing who I was actually married to. I regret the conversations I didn't have soon enough. I regret that I was so absorbed in the work that I gave Claire room to build an entire parallel life in the margins of our marriage without my noticing. But do I regret what I did when I found out? No. I made the same decision that I believe any honest person in my position was obligated to make. The evidence existed. The harm was real. The victims deserved the outcome that the evidence supported. If I had buried it, if I had protected my wife and let $43 million of fraud go unchallenged because the alternative made my personal life more complicated, I would have become exactly the kind of person I've spent my career holding accountable. Claire is living in Savannah now, near her sister. I know this not because I track her, but because her sister sends me a brief email every few months, which I believe Claire doesn't know about. The emails are short and don't ask for anything. I think her sister is simply someone who believes that people should know when the person they shared their life with is still alive and managing. I appreciate that more than I've told her. Last November, I was asked to speak at a conference for federal financial investigators in Washington. The keynote was about the ethical obligations of forensic professionals when their work intersects with personal relationships. I spoke for 40 minutes about methodology and standard of care and the structural safeguards that exist for exactly this kind of situation. Afterward, a young investigator came up to me, early 30s, recently married, the specific nervous energy of someone who has a question they're not sure they should ask. Did you ever consider, he said carefully, not turning in everything you found, just the coal materials, not the personal materials? I knew what he was asking. He was asking whether there had been a moment where I'd looked at what I had and thought about the surgical option. Take down the fraud, protect the wife. Of course I considered it, I said. Anyone who tells you they didn't consider it isn't being honest with you. He nodded slowly. The problem, I said, is that the moment you start deciding which evidence is too personal to use, you've stopped being an investigator. You've started being an advocate, and advocates protect their clients. Investigators follow the evidence. I wasn't her advocate, I was the investigator. I paused, and eventually, I had to make peace with the fact that those two things couldn't coexist in the same case. He thanked me and walked away, and I stood there for a moment in the conference hall thinking about whether I'd said the right thing. The numbers never lie. I still believe that. I believe it more now than I did 17 years ago, when I met a woman at a conference in Charlotte and thought I was pretty good at reading people. I was wrong about that, but I was right about the numbers. And in the end, the numbers were enough.